David flees. Dear friends, in the previous story, didn't we see David escaping from Saul and going to Ahimelech, who was placed in Nob? We'll see what happened further in this story. We have seen David, the youngest of Jesse the Bethlehemite's 8 sons, and a shepherd boy, being anointed as king over Israel and defeating the Philistine giant Goliath and moving into the palace, and then becoming the king's son-in-law. All the changes in David's life was unexpected. Saul disliked David faster than he liked him. That was because of Saul's fear of losing the throne. So Saul saw David as an enemy and wanted to kill him. Knowing that if he stays with Saul, he will not live, he had to leave even Michal, who loved him sincerely. Here, another phase of David's life was beginning. From now on, it was a run to save his life from Saul. David went from Gibeah to Nob to the house of Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech, seeing David alone, inquired about his coming. David didn't tell him that he was running from Saul. Instead, he said that the king had sent him in a mission and asked if Ahimelech had anything to eat. The only thing Ahimelech had was the holy showbread, which was removed that day to be replaced by flesh bread. Since David had cleansed himself, Ahimelech gave him the bread. And David asked for the sword of Goliath whom he killed, which was kept in the presence of the Lord because he hadn't brought any weapon. Then he went from there. Since Ahimelech did not feel anything strange in David's coming, he did not suspect him in anything. But a chief of the servants of Saul, Doeg the Edomite, was detained there in the presence of the Lord. He saw David's arrival and all that Ahimelech had done for him. From there David went to Achish king of Gath. Before he could appeal for help, the servants of Achish recognized that this was the David who killed 10,000s, while Saul killed thousands. David, fearing that they would kill him, pretended to be mad in their presence and escaped. Then David ran from there to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. David went from there to the king of Moab and asked to let his father and mother stay there till he knows what the Lord will do for him. And the king agreed. David and his men with him stayed in the strongholds. But the prophet Gad told him not to remain in the stronghold and to go to the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. But Saul heard about this and talked to his servants. Saul's servants liked David very much, right? Understanding this, Saul condemned his servants' faithfulness. Then Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, told Saul that he saw David coming to Ahimelech, and that Ahimelech had inquired of the Lord for him and given him provisions and the sword of Goliath. Furious at this, the king sent to summon Ahimelech, and all his father's house, the priests who were at Nob. Even though Ahimelech tried to convince Saul of the truth, Saul was not willing to listen. Instead, he ordered that they be killed. But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priest of the Lord. So the king told Doeg to strike the priests. He did that without any hesitation. Not only them, he put to the sword the city of Nob, both men and women, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. David let him stay with him. Then David heard that the Philistines were fighting against Keilah, which was a part of Judah's inheritance. David is now in Judah, right? So he asked God if he should go and attack the Philistines. God gave him permission. But the men who were with David were not that brave. They said, "We are afraid here in Judah. How much more if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" David inquired of the Lord again. The Lord strengthened him and sent him to Keilah. So David and his 600 men saved the inhabitants of Keilah from the Philistines. When Saul heard this, he summoned all his men against David. When David understood this, he inquired of the Lord about this. The Lord said that Saul will come down and the men of Keilah will surrender David and his men to Saul. Then David and his men departed from Keilah. And David went to the stronghold in the wilderness of Ziph. But the Ziphites went up to Saul and informed him that David was hiding there. And Saul and his men pursued after David. All means of escape were closed to David, but God did not leave them. As Saul and his men closed in on David, the Philistines attacked Israel. So Saul returned from pursuing David and went against the Philistines. Without losing the opportunity, David escaped from there and went to the strongholds of En-gedi. But Saul, who returned from following the Philistines, was informed that David was in the wilderness of En-gedi, and he went there. There was a cave there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. But David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. Seeing Saul alone, David's men told him not to lose the opportunity and killed Saul. David rebuked his men, saying that he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. To prove that he had no evil intent against Saul, he cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Not knowing this, Saul relieved himself and left the cave. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave, and called after Saul. When Saul looked behind him, he recognized David. Seeing the corner of his robe in David's hand, Saul realized David's good heart and his own wrong, and he went back to his home. Then Samuel died, and all Israel mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. Then David went from there and stayed in the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man very rich in Carmel. His name was Nabal. The name of his wife was Abigail. During the time David was in Paran, he and his men helped and protected Nabal's shepherds. So, when David heard that Nabal was shearing his sheep, he sent messengers with a request for help. But Nabal, who was harsh and badly behaved, denied their request and sent them away. Angry at this, David took 400 of his men and went to attack Nabal. Seeing what his master did was wrong, one of Nabal's servants told what had happened to Abigail, and told her how they had helped them. Abigail was discerning and beautiful. Understanding what her husband did was wrong, Abigail prepared food and laid them on donkeys and went to meet David. She did not tell anything to her husband. Abigail met David and his men coming against them on the way. She hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She spoke to him with wisdom and stopped him from bloodshed. Then David accepted what she brought and sent her back in peace. After about 10 days, the Lord struck down Nabal and he died. Then David heard that Nabal was dead, and he sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. Accepting this, Abigail went with David's men and became his wife. Then the Ziphites came to Saul again and informed him that David was hiding on the hill of Hakilah. So Saul arose and went out to the wilderness. David, who heard that Saul had come against him in the wilderness, took Abishai his nephew and went to the camp. Since it was night, everyone in the camp fell asleep. Saul was lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his tent. The soldiers were lying around him. David and Abishai came near the camp without anyone knowing. Even now, David did not use the opportunity to kill Saul, believing that vengeance was the Lord's. Instead, he took his spear and water jug and went out of the camp. Then David crossed over to the other side and stood some distance away and called out to the army. When Saul realized that David had taken his spear and water jug and saved his life, left David again and went back. Then David, who was tired of running around Israel fearing Saul, decided to go to the land of the Philistines. So he went to Gath, which was under Philistine control, but on the border of Judah. Achish king of Gath gave him Ziklag. He lived there. Achish also trusted him. At that time the Philistines gathered their forces against Israel. With the Philistines, Achish king of Gath and David were there. But the other Philistine commanders did not trust David, and they did not let him go into battle. So David and his men went back as per the word of Achish. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. By then the Amalekites had attacked Ziklag and burnt it, and had taken captive all the people in it, but killed none of them. David's wives were also among them. David, who was in distress because of the situation, was also put down by his men. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David inquired of the Lord and pursued the Amalekites. They journeyed a while and came to the brook of Besor. In the 600 men who were with David, 200 were too exhausted to cross the brook. So David told them to stay with the supplies. And David and 400 men with him went in pursuit of the Amalekites and defeated them. He took back all that was taken from them and plunder and went back. When they came to the brook of Besor, the 200 men came out to meet them. But some among David's followers had a grudge against them, and they did not want to share their plunder with them. But David said that the share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to battle. David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day. Then, after they arrived in Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah who were his friends. After sending David back, the Philistines fought against Israel. When the battle became severe, the Israelites fled before them. But the Philistines pursued them and killed them. Among them were Saul's sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul. Knowing that he wouldn't survive, Saul asked his armor-bearer to kill him instead of being killed by the Philistines. But his armor-bearer did not have the courage to do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. Seeing this, his armor-bearer too fell on his sword and died. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. The rest of the Israelites abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines occupied them. With the death of Saul, David's fleeing came to an end. God gave justice for David, who spared Saul's life twice. While on one hand Saul their king is dead, and on the other David, who has the anointing, is far from the throne, what would be the situation of Israel? We'll see that in the next story. God bless you.